And what is Svelte?
I love it.
Honestly, this framework has blown my mind.
It's the only JavaScript framework that's actually enjoyable to use.
Svelte.
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 My name's Rich Harris. I am the creator of Svelte and one of its lead developers. We're in my flat in Carroll Gardens in Brooklyn. I mean, an Englishman living in New York is just beyond cliche at this point, so I'm definitely not particularly exotic. How should I sit, by the way?
Just comfortable.
Yeah, like this? This is all right?
Why did you call Svelte Svelte?
Why do we call Svelte Svelte? It's always really difficult to find a name for a project that isn't already a package on NPM. We had a brainstorming at work. I was working at The Guardian at the time, and the team that I was working on became a little brain trust, and we tried to think of a word that kind of meant lean and zippy and fast and elegant and all of these things. And svelte is a word that means all of those things. It means sort of lithe and athletic, and it just felt like a really good fit. And so it stuck. A lot of people don't believe that it's a real word, or they haven't heard it. People have said that it sounds like a dishwasher tablet brand or something, but it's a real word, and it's a word with some really great connotations for the project that we're building. And so essentially Svelte is a language. It is a language for creating user interfaces on the web. When Svelte came out, the term that we used was a framework without the framework. And it was, I guess, a little bit of a marketing sleight of hand, but it also reflected the mindset that it was created with, which was rather than thinking of a framework as being something that runs your code, a framework is really a way of thinking about your code. Is that it tries to do as much of the work at the build time instead of in the runtime. What that means is that whereas, for example, React will do some work to compute the difference between what's currently on the page and what should be on the page, Svelte will take that logic and it will try and do as much of it as possible before the application even runs in the browser. And the way that we do that is we have a compiler. A compiler takes your declarative component code and it turns it into an approximation of what you would have written if you were writing this very hand-optimized vanilla JavaScript. I had left journalism school and I was looking for a job. And at the time, everyone was telling journalists, you got to learn to code, you got to learn to code, you got to have a blog, you got to have all this other stuff. And so I tried to teach myself PHP and all of that stuff. Didn't really get into JavaScript at the time, but I took a job working at a financial publication in London. And this was about the time of the 2008 financial crash. And I distinctly remember just a few months after I'd started working, this is my first job, a bunch of people got laid off because the economy was crashing. And I thought it was going to be a last in, first out situation and that I was on the chopping block, but they weren't paying me enough for it to be worth their time to fire me. So I survived. But the lesson that I took from that was, you know, if I'm going to make it in this industry, I need to become more employable. And so I started drifting into towards more technical roles. And a couple of years after that, after spending some time working on video stuff, they needed someone to do some basic HTML wrangling, essentially. And I was kind of in the right place at the right time. So I started playing with code again. And at that point, I was seeing the kind of work that was happening at places like the BBC and the Guardian and the New York Times, where they were using code, generally Flash, but also increasingly JavaScript, to produce these interactive journalistic experiences. They were doing stuff with data that I thought was very relevant to the work that we were doing at this financial publishers. And so I got, very inspired by the work that I was seeing happen at those places. I was like, I want to do that. And so I started trying to teach myself JavaScript with the help of the development team at the company. When I started doing visual journalism, the tooling available to programmers wasn't as good as it is today. There just wasn't as much stuff. And it was hard. It was really hard to write these rich, interactive applications. And so with all of the naivety of youth, I thought, I can solve this. And so I started working on a framework of my own called Ractive, which was kind of inspired by a mashup of Knockout and Angular and some of the other things that were around at the time. And it had some success, it was used by a few different companies, and it introduced a lot of the ideas that are nowadays kind of table stakes in frameworks, like single file components and stuff like that. But ultimately, it just wasn't good enough to compete with some of the bigger frameworks. And so after a few years, I became of the view that Ractive, like many of the frameworks from that era, weren't really well suited to the era of the mobile web. And the reality was that we were shipping too much JavaScript and we were doing too much work, and we needed to kind of reset our expectations around what frameworks look like. So in a way, Svelte began as an act of atonement for my sins. And you can kind of trace its origin back to Brooklyn.js, which was a monthly meetup that used to happen in Brooklyn, just around the corner from here. And one of those evenings, I was talking to Jed Schmidt, one of the people who ran Brooklyn.js, and he was talking about an idea that he'd had that would turn the code that you'd written into something else. He was talking about compilers, and I didn't really understand what all that meant at the time, but the idea kind of lodged itself in my brain. And so these two things came together. My own sense of responsibility for having built a framework that had too much JavaScript and did too much work, and this idea that you could use compilers to do a better job of delivering a really good user experience. And that came together in around Thanksgiving 2016. The idea for Svelte happened, and spent a few furious days coding, and at the end of that we had version 1 of Svelte. And it kind of took off from there. One of the earliest contributors was Conduitory, who came on board back when it was still Svelte 1 and has kept the project afloat at a number of critical times. Like, it wouldn't be here today without him. In 2019, Lee Howe joined, and in 2020, Ben joined. And again, like, I don't know where we'd be without those contributions. And so those three are all members of a core team that includes about 12 people or so, but the contributor base is actually pretty huge. If you count everyone who's committed code to just the main Svelte repo, we're talking about upwards of 450 people.
After seeing all that love about Svelte, I tried to build a site with Svelte, and I deployed it into production, and it was night and day. I submitted it to the Google PageSpeed score to see how it would do, and it takes a while to calculate, and then boom, I had a score in the 90s right off the bat. Svelte introduced new ergonomics to building websites that's made it more fun and easier than it's been in a long time. And the way that it's done that is by introducing this concept of generating reactive code at compile time. One of the first places I worked out of college was at Google, and one of the first projects I worked on at Google during my 20% time was the Google Spreadsheets formula bar and formula highlighting that I built. And I got to see how hundreds of millions of people from all over the world use that concept of reactivity to build really complex calculations. With Svelte, we're seeing the same thing. We've given people this tool of reactivity, and they're building tremendously complex applications with it.
Svelte version 1 was basically Ractive, but with a compiler. It inherited a lot of the same design, and also Ractive had an existing community, and I was hoping that some of the people who were using Ractive would come on board and use Svelte. By the time Svelte 2 came out, we'd realized that some of the design decisions that were taken with Ractive were the wrong ones, and that people's expectations had changed a little bit. And so Svelte 2 was really just a slight refinement. For example, instead of having double curly braces in the template syntax, we would have single curly braces so that it was more like JSX. And we made a few other cosmetic changes like that, but other than that, it was pretty much the same as Svelte 1. Svelte 3 was when we kind of tore up the rulebook, and we started thinking, we have a compiler, we can essentially create our own language. What would it look like if we were to create the most elegant and usable way of describing user interfaces? And whether we achieved that or not, I don't know, but I think we got pretty close. Svelte 3 was when everything changed.
I first heard about Svelte probably on Twitter. A lot of developers at the time were talking about a new release of Svelte, which was coming out at the time was Svelte 3. And I'd honestly probably heard of Svelte before then, but it wasn't until Svelte 3 came out that I really started to pay attention, as it being a really interesting technology. And I tried it, and then I wanted to teach it immediately. I wanted to share it immediately. I wanted to build more things in it. So Svelte's different, it's its own thing, because it takes this idea that for so long we've been shipping a JavaScript library, right? So the framework or whatever we're using is a library, and that whole big chunk has to go along to every user that opens up your site. They go to your site to check out a recipe or something, they're getting that big bundle. What Svelte does differently is it takes your Svelte files and compiles it to just JavaScript. As in, we're not shipping a library full of code that you may or may not be using in every project. However, we're transforming the code that you are using into smaller bits of JavaScript that you can ship to the client and not have to worry about if this project is large enough or substantial enough to include such a giant bundle of JavaScript along with every single project. I think there's a lot of hype around Svelte, specifically because people don't believe it can be that easy, or they don't believe that the code they can write is so clear, because we have a long history of writing complex JavaScript code, specifically to do interactive elements on the web. And so what Svelte allows us to do is to write code that's not only small and simple, but plain and readable in a way that I think instantly attracts people when they try it. People might hear about Svelte and the fact that it's a disappearing framework, and that might get them excited, but nothing's going to get them as excited as trying it out for the first time and seeing just how much you can accomplish with only a few lines of really simple code.
If you use something like React or Vue, it's kind of stuck together using JavaScript. And if you're very familiar with JavaScript and thinking in a certain sort of way, then that sort of system is really great and really helpful. But if you're maybe a little bit newer, or it's not even in your best interest to learn the ins and outs of different JavaScript frameworks, if you use something like Svelte, you're mostly just looking at basic HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. So I think for JavaScript frameworks and probably technology in general, there's a bit of an adoption curve. How do I want to do this? So if there's a chart of satisfaction and usage, it usually starts low, but there's a lot of satisfaction. And as it grows in usage, because people are so satisfied, usually there's like this curve where once everybody starts to use it, they feel obligated to use it, and then they all start using it, and then they're like, oh no, I was forced to use this, and so they're a little bit less satisfied, and then it like kind of dies out. With Svelte, it's hard to tell, I think, if they're just following the same curve where usage is a little bit lower and so satisfaction is really high, but it really does feel a little bit different, where there's quite a bit of usage these days, and satisfaction is still, I think, the highest or one of the highest for any of the larger or more used JavaScript frameworks. There are a lot of people doing interactive data visualization that really love Svelte. It's such a good fit for like these smaller applications that need to be really interactive and really custom and really complicated in a lot of ways. You'll see a lot of these newer data viz pieces coming out, especially from the New York Times. They're built in Svelte.
I definitely do think that visual journalism is critical to the New York Times. We live in a visual world that we can experience So we have a lot more opportunities to tell stories to readers in ways that can help them understand what's going on. That's not just using words and that's not just on paper. I probably heard about Svelte the first day it existed. Rich and I worked together at The Guardian, and I think it was after Thanksgiving break, and said, oh, I invented a new framework. And so because we worked together and we were on a small team with about 5 people, we used it immediately. And I think that the first project I used Svelte on, I think it was from January of 2017. It was an investigation into gun violence in the United States. And shortly after that, our Guardian team disbanded. I went to Spotify, where I used a Svelte for some internal tools, but I didn't really get back into using it for work projects until I got to the New York Times, where I was working with Rich again, and I use it for pretty much all of the articles that I work on. One piece is this story about Chinese propaganda. It probably, at least up until this point, has been the most complicated technical story that I've worked on because it involved somewhere over 100 videos that we needed to show them effectively and not slow down people's browsers. So Svelte was very helpful for that because I was able to just control the whole page easily. Like the whole article is a Svelte component, as opposed to sometimes when you will have a normal article and just have one little Svelte component. I use Svelte to control the whole experience, and I don't know how I would have done that story using like vanilla JavaScript or some other framework. Another story that Svelte was really useful for was this story about Y2K. So I was able to use Svelte to create this very unconventional experience where you're exploring and like diving deep and then diving out to almost sort of simulate the feel of the internet and tell this unconventional story about Y2K. The thing I like most about using Svelte is how fast you can move. I think in the world of journalism, we're often working on pretty fast deadlines. And so if you're working with a tool that has a lot of overhead, it's just things that are slowing you down and not allowing you to get to the point where you can, make your article or your piece.
So one highlight this year was building the official German vaccination dashboard. So a lot of people just check vaccination statistics on their mobile phone, so it should be mobile first. And we wanted it to be really lean and fast because we knew it would be a high traffic site and it would be frustrating for people if it would go down all the time or would take a long time to load. So all this made Svelte a really natural choice for this project. The Language of Science project for Scientific American is a really special one. Scientific American is a science magazine that's 175 years old. And they wanted to celebrate that anniversary with a special visualization of how their language has evolved and how basically the word trends in their magazine has changed. So because the project content wasn't defined yet, we were really in an open exploration of visual forms, different angles we can take on the whole thing, and being able to play through all these layout variations and different perspectives on the data in this interactive way really helped us finding an effective visual in the end. D3 is a great library for data visualization, specifically for map projections or cool layouts of data or scatter plots or whatnot. But it doesn't really help you that much in managing complex interfaces or applications with lots of different tabs and buttons and so on. And so when I discovered React, I was really excited, but then things grew and it became bigger and bigger, and also more and more plugins and more competing state management libraries, and things just became a bit too big for me. And when I discovered Svelte, it came back to this, here's a really simple way to do things.
Svelte has definitely found a home in the data visualization community, and I think that is partly because it was designed from the beginning to enable me to do my job, which very largely involves data visualization. But Svelte is in no way sort of restricted to the data viz uses. It's as flexible and generic a framework as React or Vue or any of the other things that it stands amongst. Svelte really makes no assumptions about the kind of project that you're building. And it wants to integrate very cleanly with whatever other technology you're using. For a long time, TypeScript support was one of the most requested features in Svelte. People like being able to write JavaScript inside their components. We have this single file component format. But at the time, TypeScript was becoming incredibly popular and very important in the JavaScript ecosystem, to the extent that a lot of people just won't touch code unless it's TypeScript. And so it was preventing people from using Svelte. I happen to know Orta. He's a good friend. He actually used to live down the road from here. And he's on the TypeScript team. And Orta was able to lead a project with several developers to actually build TypeScript support into Svelte. Not directly into the compiler, you still have to add a little bit of a preprocessor, but it means that now if you're building a Svelte component, you can use TypeScript and you will get all of the same auto completions and type checking as you're building your app as you would if you were writing straight TypeScript.
I interacted with Rich a few times through the JavaScript ecosystem in New York. We are both Englishmen living in New York, and I invited him to a house party, and we were chatting about where Svelte is and where Svelte could be. And at the time I was working on TypeScript, and I thought it would be a very interesting sort of exploration to see what it looks like to make the sort of tooling experience that we have in TypeScript as good in the Svelte ecosystem. Like, we didn't want TypeScript inside Svelte, but we wanted the TypeScript-like experience that people get in their editors for Svelte. I think that that is like an important part of scaling Svelte, like the ability to have your editor tell you what properties are available and how they all like intermingle. You need like rich developer tools to be able to do that. We actually built support for Svelte in an LSP, which means that it works in Vim, it works in Atom, it works in Sublime Text, and it works in VS Code. As well as trying to figure out, well, we may have all these tools in your editor, but how do you verify that your Svelte files are what they say they are and that they link between each other correctly? And that really helps you to scale code bases. We just really wanted to try and find a way to make tooling like TypeScript run alongside Svelte in a way that understood the internals of the systems, but could provide you with all of the experience that you were looking for as a developer. My involvement, I think, really helped Svelte to be able to hit mainstream adoption by providing tooling in the editor. It's like some really gratifying work. I wish I could do more of it.
And it's been huge. People absolutely adore TypeScript, and the fact that he was able to do that just blows my mind. I still don't understand how any of it actually works, but I use it every day and it's great. It's now like part of the default developer experience for a lot of people using Svelte.
I got on the Svelte bandwagon a few years ago. The popularity just got too great to ignore, so I finally just gave it a try and I fell in love.
I want a place for women, non-binary, anyone who doesn't feel safe out in the world that's struggling right now, to have a place to come and build in the Svelte community and feel like they are included. Feel like you're friends already when you join in. It's still relatively a small community, so it has that like small town community feel where some of the larger organizations that you see you get lost in the crowd.
Being here today is really cool because I've heard about it but haven't been able to sort of see it. And he talks about his friends on the internet, which to me is such a foreign concept. And it's really cool to see the energy and the sense of community, and just in New York. And imagine it sort of gives me the opportunity to understand what this could look like across the world, which is just really cool to see that he's an integral part of that.
Okay, let's go. I first heard about Svelte, I think, on the Hacker News or Reddit forums about discussing JavaScript frameworks. And at the time, I was a very deep into React person. So Svelte seemed like one of those up-and-coming things that really wouldn't go anywhere because it didn't have the backing of a major corporation. So Rich came to a New York City React meetup to talk about Svelte. And he said, you people are kind of drinking the Kool-Aid, and you don't actually need all this machinery in order to do components right. And I looked at my React experience so far, and I was considered a React expert. I could not be anywhere as productive as I could be in Svelte. And that's when it started really taking it seriously. So the famous story of how Svelte Society got started was Antony in London decided that he wanted to have the world's first Svelte meetup. And that's great for Svelte, that's great for Antony, but I have this competitive streak, and I was sitting across from Rich Harris in New York City, and I'm friends with Rich Harris, and I'm like, why is the city that has the creator not having the first Svelte meetup? So I decided to just tweet out, like, we're gonna have it on the same day. And I picked the name, and I wanted something that had alliteration because I like alliteration. And 50 people showed up, and we had talked about Svelte, and that was the start of Svelte Society.
My task.
When I understood Rich's vision and I looked at the documentation, I saw that it was a mature technology that had a lot of benefits that did not have, apart from Rich is a very effective speaker. But apart from him, it didn't really have a whole crew behind him extending its virtues. And that's something I really understand in my day job. So I honestly just took it up as a project to see if I could grow its popularity. And I think there's only so much that you can do coding, then you have to tell people about it. You have to spell it out. I saw that the technology was ready, but the community had not caught up, and the messaging or maybe the infrastructure wasn't there. So people needed to build that.
We want to help people come together and sort of advertise Svelte. What you'll see about Svelte, it doesn't have a strong PR side. It's a bunch of people who are passionate about what they're building. They aren't necessarily marketeers. They're not sort of gaining anything from it other than just their own interest, you know, making something they love to build. And so almost Svelte Society fits a few different goals. It's becoming the unofficial, official place where we can talk about things without having a sort of encouragement or advertising that particular product.
The Svelte core maintainers kind of like doing core stuff. They want to do their coding and they want to do their features and they want to improve on Svelte and SvelteKit mostly. I don't think they're particularly interested in doing marketing. It's not something they're very fond of. They're usually more about the web in general, I think. More philosophical ideas about the web. And I think Svelte Society being separate from the Svelte core organization, or whatever you want to call it, makes sense in a way that the Svelte core team is not like a corporate entity. They're not being forced into doing marketing or doing other stuff. So the core team doesn't have to get embroiled in any drama or other stuff that can come up with community stuff. They can really just focus on doing the code.
A couple of months ago, I got a DM more or less out of the blue from Guillermo, who is the CEO of Vercel, asking if I wanted to work on Svelte full time. And it was a great opportunity that I would have been an idiot to say no to. And if you'd asked me a couple of years ago if I would want to work on Svelte full time, I would have definitely said no. I enjoyed my job at the New York Times way too much, and I worried that if I was working on the framework instead of building things with the framework, that I would kind of lose touch with, you know, what the needs were on the ground, so to speak. But, you know, Svelte has reached a point now where enough people are using it and there are enough demands on our development time that not having someone working on it full time, I think, is at this point totally unsustainable. Vercel and Svelte are both ultimately about making it easier for more people to build stuff on the web and for that stuff to be fast by default. And so it makes a lot of sense to me. You would need to ask Guillermo what Vercel gets out of employing me to work on Svelte, but without wanting to put words in anyone's mouth.
I've always been a fan of Rich's approach to software engineering and software design. I was a user of Rollup. I was always following the ways that he was writing parsers and tooling for developers. And a lot of people don't know this, but the very first version of Next.js was also trying to invent a new templating language, because my inspiration for Next.js in a big way was PHP, which made it so easy and ergonomic for people to write websites. And I think we were thinking the same things. People love Svelte, and Vercel is a company that follows what developer experiences are cutting edge today and how can we make developers more productive. I'm extremely excited about this idea of an edge-first framework. What that means, and this is what the marriage between framework and platform really is all about, is that when you write your application, you're making it fast by construction. It's almost impossible to create a slow app, and I think Svelte has an incredible advantage here because Svelte has done a lot to the default app of Svelte will be fast. But can't we make the default app that you deploy fast globally for every user of the internet? That's what I think Vercel and Svelte can accomplish together. So that's what we're going to be working on, and Rich is excited to drive this mission forward.
The thing that makes me happiest about working on Svelte is seeing people who don't think of themselves as programmers, or they're new to programming, and they're building stuff that they're proud of, and they're crediting Svelte with enabling them to do that. I don't know what the future of Svelte looks like. We have a very long roadmap, a long wish list of things that we want to do with Svelte, but for us, our kind of North Star is getting rid of the barriers to entry. We want as many people as possible to be able to build stuff on the web. We've never been primarily focused on adoption. Adoption is a good metric. If the numbers are going up, it means that people are talking about the thing and other people are listening. But we would rather have a thing that a small number of people love than a thing that a large number of people tolerate. I don't aspire to be a BDFL. I don't aspire to be a benevolent dictator because, Svelte has always been this very sort of consensus-driven project, and, even if a dictator is benevolent, that still entails probably overriding the will of other people in the community. And we've always tried to develop consensus around everything that we've done. Even though you can never get everyone to agree, we want as many people to agree as possible. And I'm also not so keen on the for life part. I really love working on Svelte. I'm excited that I can work on it full time now. Will I still want to work on it 10 years from now? I'm hoping that if Svelte is still around, and I hope it is still around, that we will have found a way to make it a self-sustaining project that isn't reliant on any one individual, but is, a thing unto itself.